Welcome to What Are They Thinking, a podcast by the Herbert Institute at Utah Valley University, where civic engagement comes to life.
Hi, I'm Jim Moss at Utah Valley University's Herbert Institute for Public Policy. Welcome to What Are They Thinking, where we take a sarcastic question and turn it into a sincere effort to put ourselves in the mind of someone we might disagree with. We take two policymakers or advocates on a tricky policy question and ask each of them to do the math behind the other side's position. Today we're talking about the federal-state balance of responsibility, also known as federalism. Federalism itself is not always in the news, but its effects are everywhere. Some say the federal government has become an uncontrolled micromanager and needs to be scaled back to preserve the ideals of self-government that America was built upon. Others say the states, if left to their own devices, will fail to protect the basic rights guaranteed by the Constitution and might even take us back to the abuses of the Jim Crow era. So to help sort this out, we have two experienced, insightful members of the Utah House of Representatives with us today. Federalism Commission co-chair, Republican Representative Ken Ivory, and fellow Federalism Commission member and Democratic Minority Leader Dailey, Provost. Thank you both very much. Long-winded introduction, but I appreciate having you both. I'll add on a personal note, it's been a great opportunity to work with both of them on addressing federalism issues. So let's get into it. We're going to talk about, first of all, the problems of federal-state relations. And we're going to take turns trying to describe the other sides. When I say the other sides, the other parties. I happen to know both of these folks work very well together. So they're not here as enemies, they're as friends, but they're going to try to get into the head of the other party. So we'll start with you, Jen. What would you say in the area of federal-state relations are the problems the other side, that is the Republican Party, sees and tries to address?
I would say the two top issues for my Republican friends with regard to state-federal relations, number one would be that there should be assumed clarity between what the federal government's role is and the state government's role, and that it's perfectly outlined in the Constitution, and that there should be little deviation from that. The bigger piece, I think, that is more salient and of critical concern for my Republican friends, particularly my friend Ken Ivory, is the federal debt and the remarkable rate at which our debt and the interest payments that our nation pays on that debt, leading to national and international instability, is probably the greatest breakdown of where the federal government is stepping outside of its lane.
Okay. How would you describe their view on the severity of the problem? One of the things that sometimes differentiates different people or parties on an issue is how serious of a problem they see it as presenting right in their face or down the road. What's your sense of the
certainly on the debt issue, the right in your face is not this nebulous idea that is decades down the road, but mere years away, and that an international economic crisis that we may not recover from is certainly looming. And I think that there is a sense that generation over generation of being dismissive about the how critical that issue is, and just kicking the can down the road, is certainly something that my friend Ken and many Republicans feel is one of the most critical issues with regard to the way the federal government functions. With regard to the second issue that I brought up, which was the first one I mentioned just a second ago, with regard to how much power the federal government should have over decisions that happen at the state level, and it all comes back again to funding and how many programs at the state level the federal government funds, and if that is the proper role of government, or if that money should be collected in taxes and distributed to the states, or if that should not be an activity exercised by the federal government at all, and that all states would just make those decisions about those programs on their own. I think that has been at the forefront of, at least in my policy life, my political life, that's been a huge crux of the conversation, and where those roles lie, and whether or not there is a bright line on who has those decision-making rights, I think is actually up for debate. I think that some people view, especially my conservative colleagues, view the Constitution being very clear, and there's a clear, bright line about whose roles and where those separations are. And people, maybe along the political spectrum have different views about how much clarity the Constitution does offer.
Thank you. Thorough response. One last component to this. What is your understanding of where Republicans see the source of these problems that you've described? How did we get here, in other words, in their eyes?
I would say I'm not sure if this might be a little more agnostic to politics. I think that the biggest source, and maybe this is one area where we don't have as much disagreement, but just swings in politics, swinging back and forth between Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, and having, like you said in your introduction, who gets to decide, and not ever having, or at least over the last 30 to 40 years, an agreement between state governments and federal governments and even smaller municipal governments on who gets to decide these things, and an agreement between the various jurisdictions that there is deference, because we don't have codified anywhere an agreement between different jurisdictions, between the federal government and between state governments, that when push comes to shove, there needs to be an algorithm and needs to say, if this, then that, and that has never been an agreed upon framework.
Thank you. Okay, let's turn to Ken, your friend, and I know you guys have addressed these things as friends and colleagues. How well did she do? Did she describe the Republican position, leave anything out, over or under emphasize anything? And then we're going to switch sides, and you'll get a crack at explaining her side, and she'll rate your response.
So. No, I think she did pretty well. The interest of trying to figure out roles and responsibilities and understanding how we work together and which responsibility lies with which sphere of government is a critical conversation, and because we haven't had the conversation for probably 100 years, that things tend to centralize to that government that has a printing press and an army, and then just the appearance, right? We live in a world that's often very hierarchical, and so we tend to think that things are top down, and you've got a federal government that is top down to the states, and often our conversation is that way, but that's not the way the Constitution sets things up, and so it does require an ongoing conversation to, more akin to like a parental or a spousal relationship, and who's doing what role, and who's picking up the kids, and who's, paying the bills, and when you don't have that conversation, you get into trouble. And so I think it's very apt that trying to get clarity. I guess I would agree with the fact that there's a perception that there should be, even just from the Constitution, a greater understanding of clarity, but because we're not talking about it, we're not studying it to even go back to what that is, that it's almost like a language, right? There was a language of the Constitution, and when you don't study a language, often you lose it. I mean, I spent a lot of time learning Japanese, and did a major in Japanese, and if I were to go out on the street now and try to carry on a conversation, it would be difficult because you lose that language. I think we've lost a lot of the language of the Constitution. So I think there's a lot to that. As far as the debt goes, I mean, I think we probably both agree that it is serious, and we're putting off to our children, we're putting off to the next generation something that's just devastating, and I don't think we have any right to do that. This is like a generational warfare and generational highway robbery, perhaps, that we're putting off to the next generation. I think there's probably pretty broad agreement that is a critical issue, and that comes back to how do we do even how we might perceive government differently.
Okay, great. So did pretty well. Now let's flip sides, and you get to take a crack at the Democratic side. what is their understanding of any problem that's out there currently or on the horizon with respect to this state-federal question of who gets to decide on these different policy questions?
Yeah, I think at least my perspective of what I see coming from the left with respect to federalism is people on the right maybe don't care as much, and I probably don't even want to start that way. Let me reverse that and say I know that my dear friend Jen cares deeply about the people in our community and those that are really the most vulnerable in our society. The sick, the poor, the elderly, the children. And I think there's a perception that if the federal government doesn't step up and instill a uniformity in how we care for those who can't care for themselves, it might not get done. And then in education, if the federal government didn't set standards, it used to be children in Mississippi. Right now, they're the leading example of turning things around. But it used to be children in Mississippi wouldn't get an education. But I think there's that perception that if we don't have I don't mean this to be pejorative, but a paternalistic federal government overseeing things, then people will fall through the cracks at the state level. I think that may be the overriding perception, at least that I see and sense in what may be a dynamic of federalism or federal power. So,
okay.
How'd he do?
Another in-depth attempt to put himself in your head or the Democratic Party's head.
Yeah. So
how did he do?
I certainly think that for the last, I don't know, at least 30 to 40 years, probably since the Clinton administration, there has been the fear that absent certain baseline expectations of every state, that the local politics, whatever ruled the day, would dictate the degree to which basic needs were met. And I think that Ken really hit that on the head as far as a fear of, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as paternalistic, but the inability for a central authority to say this is the baseline expectations that every state must ensure that every person be provided or make best effort to make sure that certain basic rights are in place for basic life, liberty, pursuit of happiness to the degree that happiness can be pursued absent the basic needs. And if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, it's impossible to pursue happiness if you can't find shelter and food and those basic needs. And there's probably been an overriding sense that if there was not a central entity to say these things are critical, and if we don't set that baseline, then states will do it to varying degrees, and people can't often. It seems logical to say, well, if you don't like the way your state's doing it, just up and move to another state, and that's just not something that many or most people can do. And so, I think that Ken gets that, has really expressed that well, and that was sort of the baseline understanding of why the federal government needed to be, to some degree, in all places at all times to secure certain rights.
All right, thank you both. Good first round. I don't assign points or anything, but first round of addressing the problem. Thank you both. And so identified there some perhaps lack of clarity on which of these levels of government plays which role, which could lead to interference from one to the other, a fiscal crisis looming, and within that, a problem that if there's not federal involvement, there could be a lack of basic care and protection of rights. So having sketched the problem, let's turn to principles. So we'll start with you this time, and if you could take a shot, having sketched the problem that both sides are trying to address, which principles does the Democratic Party bring to the table in trying to address that problem? And I should say, if they have multiple principles that they're trying to apply, which we mostly do as humans, right? How do they weigh and balance those principles as it applies to this kind of federal-state balance question?
Yeah, that may be a lot harder.
This is where the points go double.
Yeah, right. The lightning round, right? The sense of we should care for our neighbor is admirable and necessary. I think and the sense that there should be a basic minimum protection of life, liberty, property, those sorts of things. Yeah, I think that is right and a given. And then I think the principle that we should have a responsible federal government that sets standards in its area. And then that gets back to what we were talking about before is, what is the area? Where should the decisions be made? I think that then feeds on itself. But from a matter of principle, we want government to be fair. We want it to play by the rules. We want it to exist to secure the rights of the people. Those are all sound principles, and I think in the debate, certainly Jen and others that of good faith, great faith on the left, that is both a necessary policy and a very laudable policy that the best of America is being charitable, helping others that can't help themselves, protecting those that can't protect themselves. I think that's a very, some of the greatest aspects of America is in doing that. I think then we run into, can the federal government be all things to all people? Should it be all things to all people? Can it afford to be all things to all people? And then what may be perceived as not caring when you get to, I think on the right side we go right-brained or left-brained, whatever it is. We go into the numbers and the spreadsheets and say, but this is not sustainable. And so then you set the very people up that you want to care about, you set them up to a reliance and a failure. And so, it comes back to, is that a salient policy? Absolutely. What's the best way to deliver on that policy? I think then we come back to.
Great, thank you. Double points for wrestling with the weighing and balancing. That's exactly what we're here for. So how did he do? And then we'll go to you to discuss his principles.
Sure. So, this is, I think, one of the trickiest sticking points with federalism in general, with wrestling with what is the proper role of government at the federal level versus states' rights. And we've had this conversation. States don't have rights, people have rights, but there's certainly a critical role for state government. And as members of the state government, I think Ken and I would probably agree it's the best place to make a lot of decisions, and where we, as a body of self-governed people, should be making more decisions. And I think that's one of the great principles that where we find ourselves at this place in time, that states have ceded, intentionally or unintentionally, however it's played out, we have ceded too much power to the federal government. And I don't want to get into the principle of how we've gotten there. But, to this idea that government providing certain services could be misconstrued as making people overly reliant on services is a careful policy discussion to have. I think that it's well demonstrated in a lot of developed nations in our world that baseline services doesn't necessarily create laziness or reliance, but in fact creates a baseline of human rights by which people are better positioned to launch themselves into prosperity and a more cohesive, peaceful society. And so I think that, you know, when we're getting to principles of where that line is drawn is more of a what are the intended outcomes versus, you know, for intended outcomes for the greater good versus, you know, this uniquely American sense of everybody should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but we're having debates about what bootstraps should actually be made of. So I would say that philosophically, yes, definitely there. How that translates into actual policy decisions and what is most meaningful for a community that is full of people who are well positioned to thrive is part of the great policy discussion that I think we're probably going to get to here in just a couple minutes.
Wonderful. And thank you for following the rounds and a great discussion of principle there. And so, we'll talk maybe about bootstraps, federal bootstraps and state bootstraps, and what do those look like and what do they address? So great imagery too. So now it's your turn. Let's talk about the principles that Republican Party, and if you want to, your friend Ken is part of that, that's fine, but sketch out where the Republican side comes from in applying, which principles do they apply to this problem? And again, where there are competing principles or intersecting principles, how do they weigh and balance them?
So one of the things that I do admire about the principles of the political right is this sense that given the right opportunity, everybody should end up at the same finish line. And I always hope, I always aspire that we are to a point where everybody always has the same starting point and the same finish line. I think that we need to have an ongoing discussion about what that looks like, but also recognize that making sure, you know, principle-wise, making sure everybody's got good roads to drive on and good schools to go to, and, you know, but where those responsibilities lie as far as what our expectations are, you know, what kind of taxes we pay. Do we need a more progressive tax system? Some of the principles that I think have lent some concern about federalism as a concept in the past have been probably a misapplication of principles, you know, and you brought this up in your intro, that there's a concern that, you know, it would be a return to Jim Crow, and the fact that federalism, a version of federalism was misapplied, misconstrued and misapplied, I think, to entrench a lot of some of our darker histories, which is unfortunate because it's led to a reality where federalism is one of those things that viscerally separates people into different camps. And really, if we're looking at federalism as of what it's really meant to be, should be something that we can all rally around and creates a better government. But returning to the true principles of federalism, I think is, and we've talked about this extensively, should be very apolitical. And so I think that, you know, from a principle standpoint, conservatives, if they want a good shot at making sure federalism moves the nation and our individual states in a better direction, are going to have some reckoning with some of that misapplication where federalism was sort of abused and, like I said, misapplied to some nefarious outcomes through, you know, some of the darker days in our nation's history.
Great, thank you. Okay, so some excavation of principles and how they're thought through on the Republican side, and a couple suggestions. How well did she do?
Jen's extremely bright, and she does well in everything that she does. But I think where I would elaborate and maybe put a little more light on some of the things that she said. When we look at darker days of our history and slavery and some of the things that way, slavery was largely attacked and overturned by states that resisted. It was federalism. You had, fugitive slave laws that there were a number of states that said, we're not going to enforce these. So, I think the misnomer of some states have done bad things, therefore the federal government is the only answer to fix the bad, I don't think that's well placed. There's a lot of bad, sadly, that has come from the federal government, and there is no monopoly on good in government, and government itself is something that we need to check and watch and restrain at every level. I think the Mississippi example is great, right? For the longest time, it was, if we don't have a federal Department of Education, children in Mississippi won't get a proper education. And now Mississippi, on state initiatives, is leading the nation in reading. They're doing reading programs that are phenomenal, that in Utah we're trying to copy. And that's the beauty of federalism, is that laboratory. And so to say we're going to create a one-size-fits-all and that's going to solve the bad, I don't think that follows. Has there been bad? Yes. Will there be bad? Yes. And I think that comes back to us owning our government in every state and being engaged and applying those checks. So anyway, that'd be my response on that.
Let's, and I think Jen probably wants to respond. Thank you for second round discussion of principles. Really appreciate the willingness to dive deep, look at the good faith of the other side, and wrestle with how they're trying to weigh and balance, deal with the history, deal with looking forward. All of this really gets to hopefully a point of looking forward and crafting good policy, right? And so if you get that first decision right, and we've talked about some of the challenges there, the clarity, the history, but if you get that right, then you can hopefully make good policy at the right level. So round 3, let's open it up a little bit and just talk about some policy areas, and feel free to suggest any of them that you're currently working on, looking at, that resulted from the last legislative session. But having gone through this exercise of exploring the problem, exploring the principles, how does that inform, I guess, and I'll come back to whether you have any surprises or things that you learned from the other side in this discussion, but let's just talk policy for a minute. Either side, how does this relate to a particular policy area that you feel strongly about and hope other people understand where you're coming from?
May I start with what we talked about this week?
Yep.
So in the Constitution, there was a great debate over whether the federal government should or should not own and control property within a state. And to solve that, they said, okay, we have the solution. If the federal government is going to own property, it should only do it for forts, arsenals, dockyards, other needful buildings, with the consent of the state legislature. Well, this week we had an announcement of an ICE facility in Salt Lake that is purchased by the federal government to be something akin to a fort or an arsenal or a dockyard or a federal prison, which seems to fit, in my mind, in that list of things in Article 1, Section 8. And yet our legislature was never consented. And so I may or may not like an ICE facility in Salt Lake. I think that's immaterial. But if I invert that policy and say, do I want a president from the other party to come in and dictate, we're going to buy a facility for a policy that we don't care what you think, and we don't even care your consent. I don't think that's appropriate, and I think really it goes back to us that we've not been maintaining those lines. But I think that's something that again, regardless of whether we like or don't like the policy, if we're not adhering to the lines and the standards, we're going to get policies that come from both directions, that whiplash you were talking about earlier, that none of us are going to like. And we're seeing that whiplash just rip our nation apart. So I think from a policy standpoint, those are some things that we can get behind together. And I'm pretty sure I know where Jen is on the policy, and she's probably pretty sure where I am on the policy. But the procedure Like you said earlier, where the decision should be made and how the decision should be made matters tremendously. And I think we're getting lost in that populism, that we're putting politics over structure instead of the other way around. And I think that takes us to a really, really bad place.
So before I go to Jen on that, just taking it back to our format of problems and principles, you've described a policy development that seems to be off track perhaps. Is it off track because of a misunderstanding of the problem at issue, or a misapplication or misunderstanding of principles? What's the source of where you think that has gone awry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of things. I think number one, we have not been exercising our role and our duty. Right? The whole point Madison talked about, if men were angels, we wouldn't need, government. But in government, we have to have both internal and external checks. And it's our job to be the external check to the federal government. Government by nature grows and grows in the name of doing good things. And that's just the way it's been throughout the history of our government. And so if we're not actively monitoring those jurisdictional lines, they get blurred and then obliterated. And I think really, I would put the blame on us. I would put the blame on us that we're not monitoring, measuring, checking. And fortunately, last session we did the continuing education, that now all state leaders, we're gonna look at a continuing education course that's being developed by UVU and other scholars. And so we're going to continually go back. We make hairdressers do it, and doctors and lawyers and plumbers. And shouldn't we know, if we're protecting life, liberty, property, shouldn't we know those lines that we're protecting? And so, I think those are some of the solutions that we're bringing back to the problem.
Got it. Jen, if you want to address that problem or take your own, a policy area right now that needs more clarity and is the concern as you see it based on a misunderstanding of a problem, misapplication of principles. How do you see it? What are you worried about?
Well, if it's okay, I want to take a minute and just maybe expound a little bit on Ken's comments. And, I think that he hits the nail on the head. The policy issue notwithstanding, and I would venture to guess that he and I probably do disagree on whether or not it's a correct decision to have an ICE facility in the state of Utah or anywhere in our nation. And that goes to a broader issue of immigration. And that's where it does get tricky, because immigration is a federal issue. It's been mishandled for dozens of years. And I don't, that's how we handle that is probably a whole separate podcast. But Ken is right. There has been no process by which this has been reviewed by the state legislature. This is something that's going into my city it's not in my legislative district, but it is in the city that I represent. And I think it represents yet another step by our federal government that is just indicative of this tendency to just come in and do whatever they see fit without checks and balances, and not just from state government, but from Congress. And I think our state legislature does great things. I don't agree with all the decisions, but it's largely functional. I am not afraid to go on record on any podcast or on any media site to say that our congressional branch, the House and Senate at the federal level, are so deeply dysfunctional, and that the executive branch has really taken advantage of that power vacuum in ways that should concern people regardless of their political stripes, regardless of what they feel about policy, because, and you use this word, we get this whiplash where half the people in the country like it, half the people in the country hate it, or at this point you've got this huge segment of the political middle who are just disenchanted, feeling disenfranchised, left behind by a government that should be working for the people, and most people don't feel that the federal government is working for them. We as a state And I don't know if, this ICE facility specifically is the perfect example, but we as a state have lost our ability to tell the federal government to stop. And we have to figure out how to get back to that. And I think it has to be a mutual agreement between Congress and state legislatures where we come to the table and say, from now on, this is how decisions are going to be made. And that's largely the work of the Federalism Commission that we're trying to get to. So thanks for letting me go right back down that rabbit hole. I'm really, really glad, Ken, that you brought that up. I think that this is one of the most salient issues that really stands to tear our community apart right now. I think we in the state of Utah, especially in Salt Lake City, we really are on the precipice of some dark times because of this decision that's been made by the federal government. And whether that goes better or worse by nature of having the state legislature involved in that conversation, I don't know. But those conversations do need to happen so that I can be accountable to my constituents, and Ken to his, and the governor to the people of the state of Utah.
If I might, an
please.
example that comes to mind, my favorite movie of all time is 1966 Academy Award, Man for All Seasons. It was Thomas More, and he's got his son-in-law there, and Richard Rich comes in, and the son-in-law says, "Arrest that man, he's bad." Well, what has he done? Well, he's bad. And well, you would arrest him for being bad. I would cut down every law in England to get him. And he said, if you cut down every law in England and you're just the man to do it, he says, would you cut down the laws to get to the devil? Yes, I would cut down every law in England. He says, if you do that and you're just the man to do it, and the devil turns round on you, where would you stand in the winds that blow then? He says, I would give the devil the benefit of law for my own safety's sake. And I'm not implying making any accusations, impugning anything, but in terms of our relationship with the federal government, I look at this and I would give the benefit of law for my own safety's sake. Whether I like the policy or I don't like the policy, I'm not speaking to that. Whether I do, you have to guess. But if we take that and play that forward to future administration, I can easily see that something would come back on this rule that we allow by not taking action by inadvertence could come back in any number of ways to and then we just play the ping pong, right? The back and forth, and now we've got the populism at the presidential level. And so, and like you said, it is tearing the nation apart. And I think getting back to structure and giving people hope that there is a rule of law and a protection and a governing partnership is really the way forward.
Well, thank you both. We have a little bit more time on policy. If there's any other area of policy that you see as presenting a problem in the ideas that you've brought out, the principles that you've both brought out, the need to protect the fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, the need for self-government, people have an opportunity to weigh in. How do you do that at the state, the federal level? Very complicated process. We have a Constitution, and I think one thing that's come out is perhaps we're not sufficiently familiar with it throughout society so that we can all weigh in and play our part. Do you see any other final policy areas in which that deficiency is causing problems where that initial question of who gets to decide is not being answered correctly, and it has effects on the daily policy issues that affect our lives?
Do you want to bring up what got us really working together in the first place?
Which part?
The whole, what are we doing about what we're putting off to our children and all of that?
The debt, that first part. I thought you were talking way back when we had our first conversation about federalism. I'm actually going to deviate just a little bit, if that's okay. As you had mentioned in my bio, I work at the University of Utah in the School of Medicine. I have a PhD in public health, and any critically thinking person will know that the way the pandemic played out fundamentally shaped what our society looks like today. I would say from a policy standpoint, especially population level, there is a lot to be concerned about with regard to the infrastructure that we're building. I'm going to come back to it, that allows every person to thrive and be healthy to the best of their ability. And we can't, I think, that's not a policy issue, that's a macro issue, and that plays out in really fundamental ways. Access to good education, access to health care, access to clean air, clean water, healthy places to live, healthy places to play outside. But I think that from a policy standpoint, states are really at this inflection point where we can do these things really well going forward, because if we continue to let federal policy shape these, we're not going to be in a great place. And so I think that from a policy standpoint, this is where federalism and state autonomy really means the most to me, because Ken and I we live in our communities. We live right inside the communities that we represent, and we have a good sense of what's going to help our communities thrive. And from Salt Lake City standpoint, it's going to be not to have an ICE facility down the street, but it also means making sure that we have fewer people getting injured or killed in pedestrian vehicle accidents. This is a really big issue for downtown Salt Lake City. That is not something that we can let federal policy decisions, federal policy decisions cannot be made. And it comes down to the money, right? If we're gonna invest resources in keeping people healthy and whole and thriving, we've just got to figure out how to make sure those resources stay in the state of Utah, in our communities, so that we can take ownership and accountability for those. So I would say policy-wise, that's one of the biggest things for me, and it's all-encompassing, because at the end of the day, if you don't have health, you really don't have much.
Well, thank you both. I have one final round.
Can I just play off of that for a second? Do we have time?
You bet. And maybe I can throw that out as the question for the final round, if you don't mind, because what I was going to say is, how do you recommend, either of you, that people can better understand, whether it's policymakers, citizens, or especially students? We're at a university here. Students look at this and think, there's a whole lot of contention and maybe more heat than light. You've both brought a lot of light to this subject, so appreciate being willing to get into the nitty-gritty. So if you want to include in your final comments a comment on a policy area, and also wrap it into how can policymakers, citizens, or students take action in this particular area of state-federal relations, which not a lot of people stay up thinking about, to be honest with you. Not a lot of hit TV shows about federalism, right? But if people have heard this and realize, okay, that affects how I live, how can they be engaged? And if you want to reference a policy area, you bet.
No, I think there will be a lot of shows as the problems get more acute. I think what Jen brought up, the state has the ability to act in public health in so many areas: land, water, air, physical health, and yet now things are being politicized at every area. And Jim, in the outreach that you did with the agencies, we're hearing from them this pendulum swing, and so they'll prepare to implement federal policies from one administration, and then 4 years later they have to go completely the opposite direction. And we kept hearing over and over that whiplash, and that to politicize air and water and health and all of these things is crazy. It's just crazy. And there's no need for that. But so then to take that a step further, I think the reason that federalism is going to be popular again, if you will, we're gonna see that focus. I was reading just last week, the Congressional Budget Office head testifying to Congress said the Social Security and Medicare trust funds now go to zero in 5 years. And it used to be 7 and 8 and 70. We're now down to 5 years. And the cut, when the trust fund goes to zero, the 70 million people on Social Security, half of whom derive half their income from Social Security, 25% of whom derive 90% of their income from Social Security, are going to lose 28%. And that's devastating. That's devastating. And so now, and when I was talking earlier about reliance, right? Relying on a system that is proving and probably would have proved unsustainable. And so now we're taking these people that are most often the most vulnerable in our society, we've created a dependence that, 25% depend for 90% on their income, and it's going away. And like you said, they're going to come knocking on our door. And the services that'll be needed, and how do we deal with that? Washington's not going to pick up the pieces. They're going to jump ship, and we have to deal with that. And sadly, that's mathematical reality now that is going to put federalism back at the forefront. How do we deal with this relationship? How do we fund it? How do we deal with it in a way that then we're not creating this whiplash, so that we can deal with public health in a consistent and meaningful way? And then to your point, how do people get involved? Number one is recognizing that you're the boss of this system, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, we the people, right? They didn't hide that anywhere. They made it 1,000 times bigger font than everything else so that we would know, meaning we have to be engaged, and we engage at the state level through representatives that are going to listen and answer your phone call and respond to your email, and you can go to their house. And even if you maybe don't agree on policy, you can have these discussions. And then that's going to shape the debate. And we've moved, both of us, in different directions to support each other because of that dialogue. And so getting involved and knowing your state representative and senator, and being able to work through the attorney general and governor, and knowing that your state is intended to be the external check to the federal government and to be that governing partner. And then how do you help your state leaders, your agents, be better at this really difficult job? I'm always impressed. One of the things that impressed me the most about state government was, whether I agree or not, this is a sacrifice, and it's hard, and I honor anyone that steps up to serve. So as a citizen, how do we support the people that step up to do that, to secure our life, liberty, property, and rights? So.
Thank you, Ken. Jen,
Final
close
word?
us out. Final words.
I think Ken's comment about, engaging with your elected officials is really, really keen. I would take it a step further and drive home the point, because I hear this a lot, and, people, especially in times such as these, when political rhetoric has reached just absolute, it's just so loud and so strident, and people are yelling past each other, that even people who live in my district who align with me politically, it turns in too often. This is not a blanket statement, but too often reaching out to your legislative representation, your representative, Senate, House, means just expressing anger about something and expecting that I can fix it, or Ken can fix it, or the governor can fix it, or any member of government has the answers to fix the thing. I would like to remind people that we are representative. We are not fixers. None of us ran for office assuming that we knew how to fix all the things, but really are meant to be a focal point for everybody's ideas, for everybody's collaboration, for everybody to come together, and everybody to be part of solving a problem. And so I absolutely love to hear from as many people as possible, but come with ideas, come with solutions, come with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and get ready to get dirty and get some work done. I think it's really, really easy, and I'm guilty of the same thing. Sometimes I want my Congress members, when they come and visit us during, they always come to visit during session, and we have lunch meetings with them, and I just want to say, stop being dysfunctional, go do something, go fix the dysfunction in Congress. And it would be better for me to say, what if you did this A, B, and C to address those things? And so representative government we need to remember that it is representative government. It is not, saying, here's a problem, please go fix the problem. Let's figure out how to get all of our communities together to solve these challenging problems, because the money's going to run out. Whether we restructure and figure out a way to continue to make sure that especially people who paid into Social Security, Medicare their whole lives have the services that they need to thrive, to be healthy. But at some point, we in the state of Utah are going to have to figure out how to backfill critical services for our most fragile, most vulnerable human beings. And we need every person at the table to come to help us figure this out for the state of Utah. And in Utah, we're really good at figuring these things out. So maybe we can, provide some examples on how other states can pick up the torch and solve these problems too.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for doing the work that you do on a daily basis. Thank you for doing the work today of getting down in the weeds on problems and principles and how that affects policy. Greatly appreciate your thoughtful responses here and bringing some light rather than just heat. That's always a great surprise and benefit. So we will see you next time on What Are They Thinking? Well, we'll take another tricky topic and plumb the depths of each other's thinking and hopefully, as we did today, give some concrete thoughts for optimism. So thank you and see you next time.